everybody. Thanks so much to Ben and the Center for the invitation to come and speak here. I'm excited to be here. The paper that I'm going to give today is based on a book that I published last year called Affective Relations, the Transnational Politics of Empathy. And when I started this project back in 2008, I started following around empathy as a kind of concept or a term. And what I was noticing was that all of a sudden empathy seemed to be everywhere. And everywhere I found it, it seemed to be presumed to be a good thing. It was what we wanted. It was what we wanted more of. So from President Obama's political memoirs and speeches, to international development training programs, to popular business and science books, empathy seemed to be posed as an almost magical, affective solution to a very wide range of quite complex structural, cultural, political, social, and economic problems. So, in particular, in Euro-North American discourses, there's an emphasis on calling for empathy or posing empathy as a kind of affective bridge between social, cultural, or geopolitical groups. This idea that if we had more transnational or international empathy, that somehow would ease conflicts, tensions, and grievances in an international frame. But despite that, there's actually been very little work on what I would call the transnational politics of empathy. That is, how does empathy itself emerge and get circulated through international geopolitical relations of power? And how is empathy translated, and how does it transform as it travels across cultural, geopolitical, and cultural contexts? So my book had two key aims. The first thing I wanted to do was to extend some of the earlier research in this area to think more critically about empathy and its political implications. And the second thing I wanted to do was to try to think about what it might mean to think about empathy from a transnational perspective. And I understand transnationality to be a set of fluid, shifting, interrelated processes linked to capitalism, neoliberalism, post-coloniality, the aftermaths of slavery, migration, diaspora, global media, and so forth. Now, there's nothing particularly new about empathy being called for as a kind of affective ingredient in international projects of social justice. And there's nothing new more broadly about empathy being linked to the political and the ethical. In fact, we could trace this back to the work of the philosophers Adam Smith and David Hume, who linked sympathy and talked about sympathy in relation to politics in a way that's very close to our contemporary understandings of empathy. We could actually go back a lot further than that to think about the Greek word empatheia and how it was linked to political practice. But I think what is potentially more novel that we've seen in the last couple of decades are, firstly, the figuring of empathy as a kind of affective competency that people could be compelled to develop in the context of neoliberal capitalism that you could actually generate capital or profit through. So thinking about how empathy functions as something that multinational corporations would be interested in this respect. Secondly, the links between empathy and international processes of securitization. How does empathy actually become an affective technique to know more about the so-called cultural other in order for purposes of regulation, biopolitical control? And thirdly, I think the rise of an obsession with talking about empathy and other emotions through the framework of neuroscience and the discovery of mirror neurons as a particular way to think about empathy and its workings. Now, I talk about all of these things in my book, and I guess I touch on them in order to make a general argument, crudely put, that despite what mainstream discourses claim, empathy is not necessarily a good thing. Indeed, I argue that empathetic engagement can actually distance as much as it connects. It can exclude as much as it humanizes. It can fix as much as it transforms. And it can oppress as much as it frees. Nonetheless, there's clearly something powerful about empathy. Despite all these critiques, people want to hold on to it. There's something that keeps it with us, and people want to invest in it over and over again, and having some power that we can't quite pin down or describe, but we see some potential in. So what I actually want to talk about today is another aspect of my work, and that's related to a question of how might we translate empathy differently? That is, how might we interpret dominant liberal, neoliberal, and neocolonial discourses of empathy in order to open up different or alternative ways in engaging in affective politics in an international frame. Now, I'm not a literary theorist. I guess I'm a cultural theorist and a sociologist, but one of the resources I've found to think about this idea of translating empathy differently that's been quite useful is post-colonial fiction and literary works. And I think post-colonial literary works are firstly often very astute in mapping the complex relationship between politics and emotions in post-colonial and neoliberal contexts. But the genre of literary fiction is also very powerful sometimes in imagining how affective life and how social relations could be otherwise, could be different than they are today on the ground. Now, the book I want to talk today about was published in 2011. It's by the British Sierra Leonean author Aminata Forna, and it's called The Memory of Love. I don't know if anyone's read this book. Has anybody heard of it? Okay, well, I think Forna is quite an interesting transnational subject herself. She was born in Sierra Leone, educated in the United States, and has lived in London for a long time. And I think the novel is quite interesting in mapping out affective relations in a complex post-colonial and transnational sphere. But before I want to move on to the book, I want to talk a bit more about some theories of empathy and lay down some context for the literary exploration. So I want to talk about what I call affective translation. And my conceptual entry point for this discussion is noticing how within liberal political imaginaries, empathy has frequently been conceptualized as an effective mode or technique through which we can come to know the cultural other. And I think it's quite important to notice here who this we is. It's usually a relatively privileged Western we. The idea in discourses from Obama's memoirs to particular strands of feminist and anti-racist theory and so forth is that through transporting oneself into the subjective world of another, empathetic perspective taking can promote cross-cultural dialogue and understanding that leads to political actions in the interests of transnational social justice. Now, for empathy to do its important cross-cultural and transnational work, these voices argue, it must be accurate. So there's an idea here that genuine empathy involves understanding the other accurately from the perspective of the other in their own context, rather than, say, projecting your own perspective or your own view of the world onto somebody else or another group. And that this genuine empathy that requires accuracy actually takes a lot of time, hard work, and skill. Now, I've been interested in noticing how this link between empathy and accuracy is actually echoed in several other domains. So for example, in the psi disciplines, psychology, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis, Empathy is often linked with an effective mode of providing knowledge that would lead to greater understanding and therefore allow one to predict what another person might think or do. And I think this link between empathy, knowledge, and prediction, especially in clinical psychology, often falls into a rather positivist framework. An idea that empathy could provide truth that would allow for prediction. It's interesting that across some of the psychological and philosophical literatures, that when they talk about empathy, they talk about being able to empathize with another person as a target. How is it possible to empathize accurately with your target? So, I thought about that a little bit. What would it mean to think about empathy as a process of targeting? What are the political implications of that? Feminist and post-colonial theorists such as Ray Chow and Elizabeth Pavanelli have argued that to target so-called other cultures often involves fixing those cultures, culturally, spatially, and affectively. It's also crucial, I would argue, to think about how empathy as a process of targeting has become important to post-9/11 processes of securitization, right? So there's this book called The Arab Mind that apparently US and other military and security officials were drawing on after 9/11 to think about, how can we get inside the mind, the subjective world of this so-called dangerous cultural other that we want to predict what they are thinking, the ways that they might act, and what they might do. So I hope that starts to bring up some of the ways that empathy in this sense can be quite problematic, or at least it's not benign. In the context of international relations of power, empathy is subject to many different uses. And when empathy gets linked to knowledge for the purposes of prediction, it can be used in the interests of regulation, control, and even annihilation of populations. So that's a contentious point that might be up for discussion later. But in this context, one of the things that I've been interested in doing is thinking about how we might move away from conceptualizations of empathy concerned primarily with accuracy and prediction. Okay, so what might it mean to think through the possibilities of empathy as translation? In order to think about this idea of empathy as translation, one of the resources that I found very provocative is some of the literatures on literary translation, and specifically post-colonial literary translation. So thinking about the work of translating texts, often not in English, of course, and located in the global South for a Western audience. What happens in those processes and how people thought about the political and ethical implications of translation. So in the midst of what's been called the cultural turn in the humanities and social sciences, and indeed in the field of literary translation, scholars of translation have moved away from what was once a key objective, arguably, in translation, and that is a goal of equivalence. That what you should translate from a so-called original into a translation should aim at some sort of equivalence. But there was a move away from this to pay increasing attention to rhetoric, cultural and geopolitical context, on difference and change. The idea that equivalence might not be a goal, but actually preserving some sort of difference might be more desirable. Translation from this perspective could be understood as practices of intercultural transfer within structural relations of power, which operated through forms of cultural negotiation rather than strict linguistic faithfulness. Now, returning this back to my concerns with empathy, if translation is understood as premised on negotiation, then it must also involve power, conflict, bartering, and compromise, as well as relationality, resistance, imagination, and change. So from this perspective, rather than posing conflict as what needs to be neutralized or eliminated through empathy, and this is what we find in many of the mainstream liberal political discourses, a conceptualization of empathy based on translation figures conflict, contradiction, and even antagonism as vital to effective politics and political transformation. Right? So if we think about empathy as translation, maybe what we're trying to do is not gain this kind of accurate truth of what another person or situation might be feeling or might be about. Maybe what we're trying to do is not achieve some sort of affective equivalence or sameness, as if that was even possible, but to negotiate with differences, to engage in a process of bartering that keeps those differences intact rather than flattening them out. So thinking further about these literatures in post-colonial translation, there's an interesting scholar who I've been looking at called Lawrence Venuti. And he talks about the implications of what he calls foreignizing translation. So he says when a translation strategy based on domestication is followed, then the text that's being translated is adapted to suit the norms of a target audience, and its signs of original foreignness are erased. So if you're translating a text in Hindi for a Western English-speaking audiences, sources of the richness and perhaps difference of that original text might be even covered over a little bit and kind of westernized in a sense to suit the audience that it's being marketed to. So he calls that strategy domestication. And he contrasts it to a different strategy of translation called foreignization. In foreignization, by contrast, the foreign is deliberately not erased so as to compel the readers that it's targeted at to acknowledge the otherness of the source. Venuti refers to this technique as dissident translation. He points to how foreignization can function as a practice of political resistance, compelling readers to rethink their own domestic norms and conventions and recognize that in erasing the unfamiliar, what's actually happening is a form of ethnocentric textual violence. So in this vein, I want to draw on these literatures and debates to say that an empathy practiced on translation might work less to achieve an accurate or a faithful equivalence than it does to revise, redirect, and open up affective relations in ways that might be politically transformative. It's also interesting that critical scholars have talked about how processes of linguistic translation often involve and in turn produce a range of emotions, feelings, and affects. So they've talked about how translation often involves a sense of loss or fear or anxiety. The post-colonial scholar Gayatri Spivak says that a translation is the most intimate act of reading. And she argues that a translation practice that doesn't simply produce neo-colonial paradigms requires that the translator be motivated by love. Not love as a kind of mainstream or standardized romantic ideal, but rather as what she calls a surrender to the text, an idea of being affectively open to being affected by what is experienced as foreign. And she actually uses the word empathy to talk about a relationship that might exist between texts, between a so-called original and a translation. If you're trying to foreignize translation in a way that doesn't just cover over or even out richness and differences, you might achieve what she calls a kind of empathy between texts, an understanding between two bodies of thought. So quite interesting, I think, in this way, to think about empathy is not necessarily a relationship between human subjects, but between non or more than human objects. The final point to make in this section is that if translation is now seen as a highly affective process, one that involves and produces feelings and emotions, there are also important questions regarding how emotions and affects themselves are translated. And what I mean by this is that even though in liberal and neoliberal discourses, empathy is often posed as something universal, right, as something everybody has or has the potential to develop that could join people, I don't think we can simply assume that empathy or other emotions are understood, constituted, or even felt the same way in very different cultural or historical contexts. So how do we think about empathy itself as actually being open to translation? Okay, so keeping all of those debates about translation and how we might think about empathy as a process of translation in mind, I now want to come back to this novel, this beautiful and I think very affecting novel by Aminata Forna. The novel is set in Freetown in Sierra Leone in two different time periods, 1968 and 69, and then the late 90s, early 2000s, which is right at the end of the 11-year conflict or civil war that happened in that country. And the novel, of course, is all about all sorts of different things, but I think one way we could summarize its interests is in how trauma, loss, empathy, and love are experienced, expressed, and indeed translated in the aftermath of violent conflict. And one of the things it does is to interrogate the role of European psychological and affective techniques in these processes. So much of the story in the novel follows a British clinical psychologist, Adrian Lockhart, who alongside a host of Western aid workers have traveled from London to Freetown with the conviction that he can provide aid and support. Now, although he has come to Sierra Leone with the conviction that he can help its people heal, Adrian's efforts are constantly frustrated by the seeming incommensurability of affective patterns and emotional norms that he feels alienates him from his colleagues in the hospital and from his patients. So for example, Adrian's a psychologist, right? He wants to use the method that he's been trained in to try to help these people that he has appointments with who have been, in many cases, the victims of horrible violence and trauma. So he's trying to use talking therapy, you know, the technique of psychoanalysis, but what he finds is that his patients won't say anything at all. They're completely silent, and from his perspective, there's not even kind of an embarrassment or kind of a social duty to fill that silence. There's just a gaping kind of, in his words, meaningless silence in the conversation. So of course, talking therapy doesn't seem to work at all at first because he's the only one talking. And it's interesting that Adrian's experience of what we might call affective dissonance in the novel is intimately linked with his sense of temporal dissonance, this difference he feels in the experience of time in Sierra Leone compared to how his life was organized temporally in the UK. It's not just that emotional norms seem askew in this so-called foreign land, but it's that time itself feels out of joint. So he talks about how in London, his life was organized by seasons and by train timetables, whereas in Sierra Leone, he argues, there's no dawn, no spring or autumn. Time feels entirely slower, and in the intense heat, he feels like a sleepwalker. He admits that in sessions with patients, his empathy feels slight and unconvincing. Now, the author, Aminata Forna, commented in a radio interview that Adrian, the psychologist, just doesn't get it at first. He tries to impose his own cultural and affective framework on Sierra Leone, and the possibility of his understanding of his patients and of the nation itself seems to depend on the country revealing and explaining itself to him, almost as if the nation was one of his psychological patients. So linking back to my discussion of translation studies, we might say that Adrian arrives in Freetown equipped with an empathy premised on expectations of domestication. He wants cultural and affective particularities to be translated for him in a way that smooths over traces of radical otherness so as to mesh with his existing assumptions and expectations. Now, Adrian's very motivations for coming to Sierra Leone are continually questioned by his colleagues at the hospital, and particularly by a surgeon in the hospital called Kai Mansari. Kai calls Adrian a tourist, and he goads him repeatedly, especially at the beginning of the novel. He frames Adrian's arrival in Freetown as part of a massive influx of Westerners, mainly NGO workers, but also foreign investors, who now see the war-torn nation as fertile ground, not only for giving something back to those in need, but also, as Kai puts it, for living out their unfinished dreams. But as Kai articulates, this sense of limitlessness, or possibility of following one's dreams, reveals precisely the geopolitical particularity of hope and affective possibility that only those in positions of relative privilege see as universal. For many of Adrian's colleagues who are native to Sierra Leone and his patients, it's not about following one's dream at the end of this horrible, violent conflict, but really much more about survival and endurance, about getting through to the next day and then the next. So although Adrian and Kai's first encounters seem convivial, they're very overdetermined by the wider geopolitical structures of power in which they're embedded. So there's this early scene in the novel where Kai comes into Adrian's living quarters he has in the hospital because he's exhausted and wants to take a nap. And Adrian's kind of just watching Kai as he sleeps. And here we have Adrian as a kind of voyeur, right? He's desperate to help people. He wants to know more. He wants to understand. But his desire for empathy seems to be premised on the power to look, indeed to maximize the visibility of his target, to see without being seen. So kind of a return to this idea of empathy as targeting. And I think things only begin to change for Adrian. The situation only begins to change when he becomes open to a different kind of empathy, right? So he has to abandon an empathy that's premised on knowledge, accuracy, and cultural mastery. He has to abandon an empathy that's about learning as much as you can to really understand what a particular culture and a people is about, and rather make himself vulnerable, to actually become open in a certain way to being affected by what is experienced as foreign in a way that might shake up and disassemble his existing cultural norms and affective expectations. And we can link this back to Gayatri Spivak's idea of translation involving a process of love that's actually about surrendering to the text. Adrian has to surrender, in a sense, to the so-called foreign affects and temporalities that he's confronted with. And actually, the only way that he really manages to do this, aside from being challenged politically and culturally by his colleagues, is by falling sick with malaria. And he's very ill, and actually Kai, takes care of him, bathes him, dresses him. That Adrian, although, he never gives up kind of his geopolitical position of privilege more generally, he's made vulnerable. And what starts to happen then is a different kind of intimacy or solidarity begins to develop between the two men. And this happens in part through a kind of temporal translation that frays hierarchical boundaries. So here's a quote from the later part of the novel. In the days and weeks that follow, the rhythms of their lives begin to intertwine. The patterns of Kai's breaks from the operating theater become familiar to Adrian, and he will on occasion endeavor to stop working at the same time. He finds he looks forward to the other man's companionship in the evenings. And there's a lot more references to kind of these processes of synchronization. The two men find themselves in the hallway at the same time. They're in the dining room at the same time. It's not about trying to necessarily enter the subjective world of another through empathy to try to really understand their psychological state or what they're thinking, but just being in time together, developing a kind of affective solidarity in a very difficult situation where you've gone through something similar together. So I call this a process of affective synchronization. And this process doesn't involve a flattening or a domestication of cultural or geopolitical differences, but rather a temporary intertwinement of rhythms, a tuning of frequencies, and a sense of shared survival in the midst of staggering losses. So gradually, through becoming open to being affected by Freetown's emotional patterns and temporalities, by sharing time and space with Kai and other friends and colleagues, Adrian actually becomes more affectively attuned to the silences, the textures, and shades of life in Sierra Leone. He begins to have less trouble understanding the accents and patterns of language, and he actually begins to understand that his patients' silences in this talking therapy aren't meaningless, that they're actually very meaningful, that they're textured with meaning, that for many of his patients, it's a way both to comply with his directions to them while also resisting at the same time. And that's linked to a whole history of quite different affective norms that are normal to them. So significantly then, rather than a project of establishing cultural authority through mastering complex cultural codes and amassing accurate knowledge of the so-called other, the empathetic attunement between Adrian and Kai develops in part through a process of desubjectification, a sensing of mutual vulnerability that seems to create an opening for different ways of affecting and being affected to emerge, and for a sense of affective solidarity to take shape. Now, as I've mentioned, this is not in any way to claim that wider, political or economic or social relationships of power are ever cast aside. And this point is crystallized by the fact that Adrian indeed always will leave Sierra Leone, and he does. He can go back to his life in London. But he leaves changed, and Kai's changed too. And so really it's only to suggest that in this context, there appears to be a link between openness and being affected by what is experienced as foreign, and a certain degree of relinquishing of control and relinquishing of certainty and a desire for mastery. But this process is not simply a direct or passive one. This is not just about emotional contagion. Empathy here involves conflict and negotiation. Adrian is politically challenged by Kai and others in the novel. He's repeatedly compelled to translate and interrogate how his own emotional norms and expectations, his own habitual ways of thinking and feeling, are shaped by the cultural context in which he's been. So my reading of Foreigner's novel, therefore, seeks to offer an understanding of empathy as translation, as something that is a relation of power in which conflict is always present. Conflict is never dispensed with or neutralized. But this kind of empathy is also about a potential openness to being affected and transformed by what is encountered as foreign in the midst of shifting transnational connectivities. Just in way of a very brief conclusion to situate this back in the context of my wider project, I guess the point I want to make with this chapter and the other chapters in the book is that empathy, or indeed any other emotion, cannot be the solution to complex transnational social inequalities and conflicts, because empathy is already bound up with and produced by these very relationships of power. So what I'd want to do, rather than trying to create more empathy, to kind of instrumentalize empathy or compassion or sympathy or whatever as effective solution, is to try to think about what looking at different instances of empathy in different contexts, including what I call empathic failures. When does empathy fail? When does it miss its target? When does it simply make no sense or have no meanings? To look at those instances for what they tell us about the contemporary operation of international relations of power and the role that affect has to play in those relations. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Do you have any questions? So, with your work on mostly post-colonial literature, how do you think that applies to the role of empathy in global media? Because it seems like the translation is definitely applicable. How do you see that as that?
I was thinking a lot about these issues late last week and early this week in terms of the recent events in Paris and how that's playing out on social media, Twitter and Facebook and stuff, and the role that empathy is playing there. And I mean, I think it's complex, but, kind of having people being compelled to, through this app created by Facebook, to have the French flag be the background of your profile pic. As far as I know, there's not the same option to have the flag of Lebanon, for example, or other places be the background. And I'm wondering if there's a sense in which empathy becomes kind of a meme, kind of a preset way that you're called to respond to these very complex and harrowing international events that, of course, have a long history in a way that I'm not sure translation is happening. So it becomes a meme that invites certain people to participate in a kind of an empathetic response that's posed as universal. But of course, that response of having the French flag, a symbol of nationalism, as your background, plays into a much larger pre-existing history of us and them, of kind of, competing nationalisms that I'm not sure engages in that politics of translation. I don't know. I guess that's a complicated way of saying that I think empathy is being called upon in very standardized ways, and I'm suspicious of how much room there is in those spaces to engage in the politics of translation that seems to be happening more in other kinds of spaces, but I could be wrong.
Journalists could correct that.
Yeah. I guess correct isn't probably a word I would use. Realign. Yeah. When I was doing this research on translation, and whenever I say translating an original into a translation, I always kind of put original in inverted commas, because I don't think there ever are any original texts. And one of the things I was reading about was about translation in global news media. And the people that were working in global journalism were saying, well, there's really no original text. If you're translating something, you're piecing together all these bits of different things to kind of come up with your translation. And I don't know, I think maybe that works as a metaphor to try to think about journalism being involved in a process of showing that cultures aren't bounded in the first place, right? The translation isn't actually a process of kind of, okay, there's this cultural group and this cultural group that are singular and bounded, and we could translate what they do and what they think and what they're about into what we do and we think, but more looking at a kind of heterogeneity of transnational relations and patterns of influencing one another. That, I think, would something that kind of journalism does engage in that could be helpful in kind of thinking about disrupting that kind of us and them that I think responses to empathize often end up falling into rather than disrupting.
Do you believe in empathy? You?
Yeah, I do. I do believe in empathy. Like, Well, it depends what you mean by that. Do I think it's necessarily a good thing or works
I'm asking if you believe it's even possible.
Okay, yeah. I don't know because, well, I believe it's possible, but what I do think is that I wonder how frequently we actually feel empathy.
How is it possible?
So it depends how you define empathy. If you define empathy as literally feeling what another person feels, whether that's through some type of spontaneous kind of fellow feeling through sensing, or whether it's through more of a process of cognitive or imaginative construction of the other person's psychic state or feelings in their own context, I think there's a lot of ways to go towards that, but I don't know how you would ever verify the so-called accuracy of that. I don't know.
Convince me that it is impossible. In this really fascinates me. I didn't come with a preconception about what you were going to talk about, but you've convinced me of its impossibility. And I think that I'm coming to a conclusion too early because I haven't had time to process everything you've talked about. I've got a slow brain. Too fast. No, you don't. But the only sense in which I feel that empathy can actually exist is if you directly experience exactly the same that the other, which suggests empathy can't exist, that the person next to you experiences temporally and spatially at that same instance. Because otherwise the idea of empathy immediately predisposes a power structure. You offer empathy almost as a gift because you're more fortunate. You know, can we be empathetic to what's happened in Paris? How can we be? Truthfully within ourselves. Oh, thank God it didn't happen here. How awful.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are some really salient thoughts, and I think a lot of the work that's been critical of empathy has been kind of for those reasons. I mean, can you ever get out of the relationship of power, which empathy, at least when it's called for as kind of international, transnational empathy, calls for? But I think, I mean, that's in a way why I'm interested in kind of moving away from this idea of empathy premised on absolute knowledge, accuracy, and prediction. I'm just not sure how helpful that is. So I'm kind of, I guess, wanting to broaden our understanding of what empathy might be. What if we understood empathy more broadly as a practice of affecting and being affected in the context of some kind of emotional resonance or relationality that's not necessarily premised on that direct inhabiting the psychic or affective state of another? Does that open it up in a way that might be more conducive to thinking about the events in France or kind of whatever transnational issue we're interested in?
I don't want to hog you, but I'm going to ask you one more thing. It fascinates me that you chose a book that I've never heard of by an author that I haven't come across, but that it was located in Sierra Leone and Freetown. And it took me to an author that I've loved from years ago, Graham Greene, and his writing. And it seemed fascinating that was the pertinent text that you chose and that you obviously love to examine in your work. Because for me, although I haven't read it, so I know not enough about it, this book, and I will read it now, and you've interested me enough to read it. It's almost like a repeated history. Although the stories may be different, the context resonates with that which was written many, many years ago by a very clever bloke from Berkhamsted in Buckinghamshire. And this idea, it interested me, this idea of, was his name Adrian?
Yes.
Him going to Sierra Leone. I'd like to read a sequel where Kai comes to London. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I mean, in this chapter, in this book, actually the novel itself, not all of it's told from Adrian's perspective. So you have a lot more from other characters' perspective, but the version I've given you today is from Adrian's perspective. But that poses a problem for me in the wider context of my book and my argument, right? Because once again, it's a white, male, middle class, Western person who we are in a sense being called to empathize with. We're seeing his journey through Freetown from his perspective.
Represents us.
Yes, yeah. And I talked to the author. She came to a colloquium we organized, and she said that's precisely what she wanted to do. She wanted, given this is post-colonial literature, but it's written in English and it's marketed to a mainly Western audience. She wanted to have a central character who she felt many of the readers might identify with, if not fully or completely, of what, experiencing. And he's quite a naive character too, but there's more to him. And I think that's part of what's interesting in the novel, is she's not actually just painting this stark post-colonial world where you have kind of the West and the rest, although those relations, of course, loom large in the background. This is more about transnational complexities. And Adrian and Kai both turn out to be much more complex characters that could be captured by any kind of cultural tropes. I guess I thought that was important to the kind of message of affective relations that she's giving.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the rise of empathy discourse, because in my eyes, the return to talking about Humean ideas of sympathy comes because the language of moral obligation is dying out. And for Hume, morality just is our aversion to things or our warming to things. That's just what good and bad are. Isn't empathy being used simply to try and get people to widen out their emotive ideas of morality so as to prevent it from being far too localized?
Yeah, I think when it's called for as a kind of transnational obligation, and it might be linked to kind of some of the discourses in cosmopolitanism, right, where you're, it's really trying to think about, well, who are your obligations to? Are they simply to your family, your friends, your people and your community you live in, or your nation, or does it go beyond nations? And if we understand the world as kind of transnational, so interlinked in all kinds of ways that exceed the boundaries of community and nation, doesn't that exceed our affective, ethical, and moral obligations? So definitely I agree with you that that's been central to kind of the resurgence of these discourses. But you have that in a context where the discourses are being articulated in some quite contradictory ways. So in a lot of the popular business literatures, for example, empathy is talked about in the language of social justice and care, but really what it's about is providing an affective technique to get into the minds of potential customers or consumers to think, what would they really want and need that you could use empathy to design and produce? So empathy becomes a kind of affective technique of access to generate profit and capital in the context of kind of neoliberal capitalism. So the idea of obligations there, for example, well, it becomes complicated to say the least.
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to make, though, is that empathy comes about because the language of obligation has died out.
Okay.
So instead of thinking that people are morally obligated and you must do certain things for an ethical perspective, what we're trying to do is to encourage people to have certain emotions towards things, because it is emotion that now governs towards ethical actions rather than a sense of obligation.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, and that absolutely, that comes out in kind of a lot of these debates too, in terms of though, like, how do you compel or how could people engage in a kind of affective transformation of self that would actually compel them to care about things or feel responsible about things outside their kind of localized orbit? That's why emotions and affect become important in these debates, because people are trying to think about, well, what actually makes people do things? What makes people change their perspective potentially? How, if people are going to change, they need to be shaken up. They need to kind of be compelled to see the world differently. And that's where, I think, as you suggest, empathy comes into it. The problem, as I see it, or one of them, is that can very easily fall into a kind of individualized emotional response to quite complex structural problems. I'm not saying that affect shouldn't be part of how we think about these problems, but I think it's quite easy for that to slide into a kind of, thinking about transforming each person at an effective level, that's going to change legacies of, colonialism and whatever. Yeah.
But maybe that is the only way. Maybe that's why Adrian goes to Sierra Leone. That's why people, join NGOs and go and help after there's earthquakes or in disasters, or to make people recover from Ebola and put themselves in that dangerous position.
Yeah. Well, I guess if
So
you...
that's the spatial, unless you're there, exposed to the same dangers.
Yeah. Well, that's the other problem with this particular chapter in my work, is that it requires a very face-to-face being there-ness. This idea of empathy as affective synchronization requires bodies being in space and time together. But one of the questions I raise elsewhere in the project is, well, what about when that's not possible? And most cases, it's not possible. If you're thinking about transnational relations or obligations, the whole point is that you're often thinking about people who you don't know and will never meet, and are often made to think about as not being individuals, as being part of groups that are somewhere elsewhere. So how do we, like, what happens to empathy or other affective relations then?
It's so interesting, isn't it, that one of the most powerful resources for removing threat from oneself is to have what governments refer to as assets that are embedded within the other.
Yes,
That
yeah.
hopefully are the other originally in some way affected in order to have empathy with our, if you like, for want of a better word, Western values, in order that they can subvert their own culture.
Yeah, I was thinking about writing a paper on Homeland, the series, to think about empathy and securitization, and
Yeah, you got it.
haven't got there yet. But did you have a question?
Yes. Sorry, this is going to be a little bit rambling, but when you were talking about the empathy in response to like the Paris attacks, and then people start empathizing, they put up the flags on their Facebook status and that. And there's been a lot of criticism because there hasn't been the same showing for, say, Nigeria and Kenya and Burundi. And there's also a lot of criticism towards the journalists, and they said they did not put much of a height onto those bombings as towards what's in Paris. But then some journalists have said that it was not so much that we didn't write it so much as the people didn't want to read.
Yeah.
My question is, like for instance, in Africa, the BBC's main correspondent lives in Johannesburg in South Africa, which is usually one of the most developed cities and one of the most developed countries in Africa. And then he's writing about the people in like Kenya, for instance, and everything else. He isn't able to go out and have direct contact with them. He's not experiencing life on a normal, everyday African level. Is that probably hindering journalist translation of the work, and that's why we're not truly able to create empathy in the writing of such incidents as we were able to do in Paris?
Yeah, I mean, and you're going to know, all of you are going to know a lot more about this than I do in the particular realm of kind of international and transnational journalism. But I think what you're describing is a complex history and set of practices that have created the conditions through which journalists in various locations work today. And that's where, for me, individual affective responses, calling for more or less empathy, might be useful, might be important, but they don't get at the complexities of those histories and those structural relations, right? So if we're going to think about why certain stories are covered and not, and the news values therein, and how they link to the political economy of international news media, that's a massive set of issues that we need to engage with at several different levels, and I'm sure that you are. And affect is certainly part of that, but there's not kind of a calling for more or less of a certain emotion that's going to help us grapple with that kind of complexity.
I really enjoyed your talk. It was really, really interesting. There was two sort of questions I had. One was about, I guess, about the sort of media and sort of popular culture more generally. It seems to me that increasingly empathy and other kind of similar emotions are often used as entertainment in television and so on. You know, you can watch a program about DIY and then, you know, how to train your cat or dog, or, you know, and improve your health. And, you know, there's a whole kind of series of things that are all about kind of certain forms of empathy and, you know, kind of self-worth and self-improvement. And I wonder, in a way, you talked about empathy often being a kind of about mastery and about, you know, acquiring knowledge of the other. I wondered whether you thought, perhaps in a more popular culture sphere, but possibly also in politics, it's also about kind of suppressing forms of knowledge, or blocking forms of knowledge, and offering something that's quite tokenistic,
Yeah.
but that doesn't address the sort of underlying
Yes.
things. And I suppose the other thing I just wondered about is partly picking up on what Joanna asked, but how you arrived at kind of post-colonial fiction as a sort of way of thinking through some of these ideas.
Yeah. Well, with your first question, I mean, absolutely. I guess there's a lot written about the commodification of suffering and the commodification of sentimentality, and I think empathy plays into it. I was thinking a lot about all of the kind of reality-esque shows that depend on somebody dressing as a Muslim woman for a day to understand and empathize what it would be like, or dressing in this particular way, or be, you know, and I mean, there's a whole history of that if you look back, and maybe in some cases that can be affectively disruptive in a kind of, you know, somewhat revolutionary way for people. But when it's, as you say, when it's kind of, there's a conveyor belt of all these types of shows that we tune in for like 20 minutes or 23 minutes or whatever the episode is, and that's almost kind of what we expect to find. It's not kind of shattering, it's not surprising, but it's the kind of entertainment that we expect to be offered to us. It seems that its potential to kind of provoke or interrogate in a more interesting way might be lessened. The idea of post-colonial literary works, well, I don't know. There's a chapter in the book about Obama's speeches and memoirs. There's one on international development training literatures. There's one on popular science and popular neuroscience. But in terms of trying to think differently, and I guess kind of imagine not only like how the world could be different, but how emotion might be thought about differently, how empathy might work differently. It's just fiction that seems to provide more possibilities, that's not bounded. If I look at the international development training literature, there's lots of interesting stuff going there, but it's kind of bounded to the language of, you know, the international aid economy, what's possible on the ground, what's happening, what they can kind of build into training programs, where kind of these literary works offer a different affective language and sense of possibility about what we could talk about. But yeah, I guess that's